Hello and welcome to Global News Today, bringing you exclusive insights and fresh perspectives from leading experts and influential decision makers every weekday here on Arabiya News. I'm Tom Burges Watson. Coming up on today's program, Biden appears to call Trump supporters garbage, sparking outrage as Republicans seize on the controversy. That comment surfaced just as Kamala Harris was urging voters to move past political drama and conflict during her final address of the race. Donald Trump has criticized Biden's comments, accusing Democrats of running a campaign of hate. And Donald Trump closes in on Kamala Harris's narrow lead as both presidential candidates travel to the swing state of North Carolina. Hello and welcome. The U.S. Vice President Kamala Harris delivered a significant campaign speech in Washington last night, urging Americans to move on from divisive politics. However, her address risked being overshadowed by a controversy sparked by the current President Joe Biden's recent remarks, where he appeared to call some Trump supporters garbage. That's a comment that has quickly ignited backlash.
And just the other day, a speaker at his rally called Puerto Rico a floating island of garbage. Well, let me tell you something. I don't know the Puerto Rican that I know, or Puerto Rico, where I'm in my home state of Delaware. They're good, decent, honorable people. The only garbage I see floating out there is his supporters. His demonization of Latinos is unconscionable, and it's un-American.
President Biden speaking there. Well, according to the White House, Biden's remarks specifically targeted hateful rhetoric directed against Puerto Ricans. But Republicans and Trump's campaign team were swift to condemn it as an insult to Trump supporters. Well, in response to the backlash, both the White House and Biden clarified the president's intention. Well, Biden took to X to explain he was addressing divisive language used at the rally held in Madison Square Garden, not making a blanket statement about Trump's base. Well, Biden clarified, quote, "Earlier today, I referred to the hateful rhetoric about Puerto Rico spewed by Trump supporters at his Madison Square Garden rally as garbage, which is the only word I can think of to describe it," adding that this was all I meant to say. The White House supported Biden's statement, specifying that he was referring to a particular comedian who made offensive jokes about Puerto Ricans during the rally, not Trump supporters generally. Well, a transcript released by the White House further clarified that Biden had condemned the rhetoric as unconscionable. Well, the White House Deputy Press Secretary Andrew Bates reiterated in a statement that Biden's garbage comment was directed at this divisive language, not a group of supporters. Well, Biden's comment surfaced just as Kamala Harris was urging voters to move on from political drama and conflict, adding that the United States of America is not a vessel for the schemes of wannabe dictators.
America, for too long, we have been consumed with too much division, chaos, and mutual distrust. We have to stop pointing fingers and start locking arms. It is time to turn the page on the drama and the conflict, the fear and division. It is time for a new generation of leadership in America. These United States of America, we are not a vessel for the schemes of wannabe dictators.
Well, Donald Trump quickly capitalized on the incident, accusing Democrats of running a campaign of hate. He took to the platform X to say, "While I am running a campaign of positive solutions to save America, Kamala Harris is running a campaign of hate. She has spent all week comparing her political opponents to the most evil mass murderers in history. Now, on top of everything, Joe Biden calls our supporters garbage. You can't lead America if you don't love the American people. Kamala Harris and Joe Biden have shown they are both unfit to be president of the United States. I am proud to lead the biggest, broadest, and the most important political coalition in American history. We are welcoming historic numbers of Latinos, African Americans, Asian Americans, and citizens of every race, religion, color, and creed. It is my desire to be the president of all the people." Well, with less than a week remaining before Election Day, the race is incredibly close and tensions are high as both sides attempt to control the narrative in the campaign's final days. Well, for more, I'm joined now by the political commentator and Republican strategist, Scottie Nell Hughes. Great to have you with us. Thank you so much for talking to Arabiya News. Back in 2016, there was an article in GQ in which you were described as being the world's most loyal Trump surrogate. And I'm curious to know whether 8 years on, this is still the case.
It's absolutely the case, but it's not just being the most loyal to the Trump surrogate or to Trump himself. It's being loyal to the agenda. And I think that's what people have blended the man with who the movement. And the reality is the majority of Americans, yes, while they like Donald Trump, they like the fact that he's the person that's been put at the top, that's the face of it. The reality of it, it's really a movement that has been coalescing since 2008 when Obama got into office and told people that they could keep their doctors if they wanted to. And that was an absolute lie, the birth of the Tea Party, that ultimately in 2016 resulted in Donald Trump. Now here we find ourselves in 2024 with absolute record inflation, high interest rates, low support internationally for many of our foreign adventures that we're doing right now. And so I think people are going, we need to bring it back to where we were in 2016, where we put here in America, we need to put America first. And when that happens, when America is prosperous, then other parts of the world also seem to thrive as well. And I think it's more about the movement than the man, but yes, I still consider myself a very loyal supporter of it.
So the court cases, the gaffes, the January 6th situation, none of that has done any damage, as far as you're concerned, to the enduring appeal of Trump and his movement?
Well, no. And I mean, obviously what they've done is they've made people think twice before they go to a political rally. They make people look and see that, yes, the government does target whether you are a small individual business or a multi-millionaire / billionaire who was a former president. The government, the DOJ, do try to entangle you. So I think what, if anything, it is strengthened because it's kind of exposed what everyday Americans have been experiencing for decades. It put it all in the last 4 years right in front of our face. And so I think that's why you've seen this movement go stronger and grow stronger, why you've seen people like Elon Musk, as well as like RFK, Kennedy, come out and join the team of Trump because they're actually being open, their eyes are being open to what majority of conservatives have been talking about since the 1980s.
But other people have come forward as well, haven't they? It hasn't just been friends of Donald Trump, former friends turned adversaries, we assume, have come out. People like General Kelly, who has triggered a lot of discussion with his comments on Trump's mindset, his propensity to authoritarian-style leadership and his liking of dictators. Reading some comments where you've been interviewed on the subject, you don't seem to have attached too much importance to what a four-star general said.
Well, it's interesting because prior to General Kelly being dismissed from the Trump administration, he was definitely a supporter of Donald Trump. And when you look at why he was dismissed and the fact that his foreign policy, a lot of the foreign policy we're seeing implemented today that is very unpopular by the people who are actually having to have their families go off and serve and implement it, you could see why him and Trump clash. Trump has a very much a Monroe Doctrine type of mission, and the fact of making sure that we're not going to be involved with in the United States unless it has something directly to do with our national security. And that, unfortunately, is not how the Biden administration has profited, both personally as well as their administration. And that's why I think General Kelly's foreign policy and his military strategy has more to do with like what you would see the neocons / the Biden administration has tried to pull off. So no, you look at those that are around. I'm sorry if I can't put much credence in people that have been dismissed, but let me tell you this. In 2016, what you had was an inundation of folks that were not necessarily a part of the Trump agenda. A lot of people that did not speak favorably of Trump while he was running, never thought he could run, outwardly bashed him, were brought into his administration. You kind of brought the snakes in the house. So when Trump realized this, thinking that as a business, you bring people in, you think everybody's working together to make a successful business and a goal, Trump learned real quick that's not how politics works. And the White House is not a business, that you have people there for their own agendas with their own intentions. And I think he real quickly figured that out about General Kelly, hence why he dismissed him. And now you have this bitter round of former Trump people from 2016 who were never really on the Trump train or on the Trump agenda, supportive of it, but really just wanted a job. And now they're bitter and they're making the rounds. And I don't think it changes anybody's vote that General Kelly speaks against Donald Trump. If anything, it might strengthen those that don't want to see America involved in more forward intervention that we have no necessarily dealings with.
Yeah, but it's interesting, though, that enemies list that even Kamala Harris referenced in her address last night in D.C. She says, I don't have an enemies list, I've got a to-do list. What do you make of this idea of the enemies list, and who's on it?
I don't care what you call it. You cannot say that right now this administration does not consider Donald Trump their number one enemy. Not terrorists, not people that are coming in and are bringing in disease, and certain folks that are bringing in disease. They don't consider them the enemies. They consider Donald Trump. And as we have learned what Joe Biden very honestly for once said, he considers anybody that supports Donald Trump to be garbage today. And it's funny that this is coming out 5 days before the election. I'm glad it's publicly being stated because it's how the majority of Trump supporters have felt the last 4 years underneath this administration. We knew that's how their outlook was of us. And that's really sad to think that, at least 50% of the American population you think is garbage. So she can call her list whatever she wants, but she has considered Donald Trump her number one enemy. And his supporters are obviously right behind him on that list. And I think that is why you are seeing their campaign absolutely tank as quickly as it started.
Let's just talk about that Biden gaffe a little bit more. Obviously, being described as garbage is presumably offensive to people like you who support Donald Trump. How damaging do you think that is for Joe Biden? And do you think it did any harm to Donald Trump, or his supporters will simply just disregard it?
Oh, they're not disregarding it. They woke up highly offended by it. Now, it's interesting you're saying Donald Trump supporters being offended. We're supposed to be pretty thick-skinned, obviously, with Donald Trump, who sometimes has had his own gaffes. But what makes this different is you've never had a president of the United States insult such a large amount. They go after each other all they want, very personal in history, but they've never actually gone after their supporters. And that's what makes this extremely different from past campaign sort of digs at each other. But here's where I think it's interesting. And you're even seeing it on the left. Some of their highest donors are even questioning, why would Joe Biden do this? We know that he's obviously been in cognitive decline. Kamala Harris and the administration has hid it from us for the last 3 years, which should be a big red flag to the American people on some of his decisions that he has made. But now you have this case. And what I feel like back in June, after Joe Biden debated Donald Trump, you had a letter come out from a celebrity, George Clooney. It kind of released the floodgates to tell Democrats, yes, you can join in the chorus that we're all thinking. You publicly say that Joe Biden does not need to be at the top of the ticket. I feel like yesterday was that moment. I cannot think that despite all of the issues that people might have with Joe Biden, that he did not have some sort of that you can't say he was confused when he said it, that he did not have some sort of reasoning behind saying such a damaging word, not to Donald Trump, but such a damaging word to the Kamala Harris campaign. Because up until this point, they'd been getting this momentum off of a very poor joke made by a very distasteful comedian at the Donald Trump Madison Square Garden rally. That had been what the media had been feeding on. Now the media can't ignore this, and they're having to talk about it. And that right there, I think, is extremely damaging, because Kamala Harris has tried to sell this thing that she's joy, she's hope, she's unifying, and it's really hard when the current president, the person that you are serving underneath, calls half the people garbage. I think this is probably if there wasn't already the coffin going into the ground, this right here was the start of putting the dirt on it. I think you're going to see more and more over the next few days, the Democrats continue to shrink back from the Harris-Walz campaign.
Yeah, it sounds a lot, doesn't it, like the basket of deplorables, which not a former first president, but a former first lady used to describe Trump supporters 8 or so years ago. I just want to ask you about the Madison Square Garden incident involving Tony Hinchcliffe, since you reference it there. I mean, how big of a mistake do you think it was on the part of the Trump campaign to have someone on the stage making jokes that were supposedly vetted, or at least checked through by some of the people on the Trump campaign team? How do you feel about things like that slipping through the net, and how damaging do you think it is?
Okay, well, as a presenter yourself, it's not just you. You have a whole layers of staff, correct? That you don't just get to go out on air, and yes, you have your own thought, but 99% of the time, they at least know where you're going with it. That's what a good staff does. in this case, I don't hold the comedian responsible, as so much of the even conservatives are harping on the comedian. No, the comedian did exactly what he's always done. Anybody's ever listened to his podcast, anybody have ever seen one of his comedy shows, he's extremely popular for that reason, because he says ludicrous, absurd, insulting comments like that. That being said, the fault of this, and it's sort of like what we saw in 2016, is somebody invited him. Somebody thought it was going to be a good idea to put him on that stage. That somebody doesn't need to be allowed anywhere near the White House. And I'd even say the RNC. That somebody should never be around campaigns again, because that was one of the most gravest mistakes. I mean, look at it. You saw it. You watched Madison Square Garden. I mean, Taylor Swift, the Beatles. Go down your list of all of these, historically musical icons that were able to sell out Madison Square Garden. We had a politician do it. We had not only that, but they did it in 3 hours, and granted the tickets were free, but it's still incredible that in a blue state like New York, that Donald Trump could fill a stadium like that. And they weren't there to see Beyonce supposedly sing or to see Bruce Springsteen, who have both sold out Madison Square Garden. No, they were there to see Donald Trump, the future president of the United States they were hoping for. That right there just shows that there are people that are engaged in the political system. That should be a positive. But instead of coming out of it, even as a Democrat, let me say this. If Kamala Harris or even Michelle Obama had been able to fill up Madison Square Garden, I wouldn't necessarily like what she was saying, but I would say, wow, that's amazing. You have been able to rock star level people's engagement in the political system and what is going on today. That many people are paying attention, even if it was on the other side. Going out of this, the left knew they were going to have to grapple to try to find things to criticize such a historical moment. And yet, the comedian just handed it to him on a silver plate, and that was the focus, that was the messaging that came out of Madison Square Garden. Nothing else, very little else was ever focused on in the mainstream. And so for that perspective right there, I think it was a great event. I think long-term, we're going to, that's going to be definitely in reflection. But the comedian definitely was a dark cloud that didn't need to be there.
Yeah, and we've seen, haven't we, in the last 24 hours, Donald Trump very much in kind of service recovery, disaster management mode, trying to win back and win over Latino voters, because they're a seriously important demographic, especially in some of those swing states. But I mean, putting your political preferences to one side, just strategically speaking, in terms of the numbers we could be talking about, how damaging, I mean, how many votes could that whole incident have cost Donald Trump, or don't you think it will cost him at all?
I don't think maybe initially, but you have to understand all of these different demographics the Republican Party has always had an issue with, whether we're talking about women, African Americans, Hispanics, even, you've got seen outreach into places, into people that Republicans in the past have just dismissed, hence why they lost in 2008 and lost in 2012. So the good news is, and once again, it's one thing to be called a whole island to be called garbage. And let me point out, when you had Hurricane Maria hit Puerto Rico, and this is, I think, why a lot of Puerto Ricans aren't necessarily falling for it unless they're trying to get some face time, is he was the first country to step up, first president to step up and give millions, actually one of the largest aid packages to Puerto Rico, initially, promising it to the country with some stipends that it would actually go to the people and not sit in a warehouse, which we later found out that a lot of it did. So his actions in supporting Puerto Rico are definitely a lot different. But if we're going to start holding national leaders accountable for the people who speak not only at the rallies, but for their supporters, we're going down a Pandora's box that I believe that once we let that genie out of a bottle, I think that it does no good for our political system and continues to make people have a very much a negative feeling towards anything that has to do with the election system.
Yeah, but it does say something about judgment of character. And we talked already about General Kelly, who was in the entourage, and by no means the only person from Trump's previous entourage that suddenly turned into an enemy and was no longer, and suddenly started speaking out openly and aggressively against Donald Trump. Do you think he's got a bit of an issue when it comes to judgment of character?
Well, let me say this. My mother used to always tell me, she says, you can always tell the quality of a person by the quality of their enemies. And when you're at the top, especially as Republicans and as this party continues to diversify and grow, you're not going to be friends with everybody. Heck, you're not friends with everybody in an elementary school, kindergarten class either. And that happens all through our lives. The more that you continue to try to change And as long as and I think Donald Trump is truly sincere in trying to change what the bureaucracy that has been built in the United States government, as long as he's going to continue to try to change that, he is going to take fire. He is going to make enemies. People are going to find reasons not to like him. That is just the nature of the business. That's going to go with it. In fact, I don't want a president that everybody likes, because that means that there's something wrong with the people. I always say that one of our biggest problems we have here in the United States is we keep putting people back into office that do nothing for their own communities. You go into these very urban areas and they've elected their congressman to the House, not 1, 2, but 6, 7, 10. They're career politicians, and yet their neighborhoods are continuing to be decline. There's less safety. There's no money going into their schools, and yet they keep re-electing the same person. That is a problem in America. And so I think, the fact that Donald Trump has enemies and the quality of they are and their motivation for being his enemy, their motivation is personal. It's not about doing what's best for the country or doing what's best for our United States military and General Kelly's perspective. It's what's doing best for him. And so I have no problem with Donald Trump being the bully to the bullies. And that's kind of why he is so different and why he's continuing to take the blows he does.
Let's just talk about the polls quickly. It looks like the gap has narrowed quite a bit, and obviously it does vary enormously from one poll to another. Just like to ask for your thoughts as to why the gap has narrowed. I mean, a couple of months ago, Kamala Harris did have a pretty clear lead, and quite a consistently clear lead, and that doesn't seem to be there anymore. Is this part of the Trump strategy, do you think, to focus more effort and more resources at the latter stages of campaigning?
Well, it's going to be a nail biter. I can't guarantee. I would hope that we would have a winner by midnight on election night. Can't necessarily guarantee it. It's going to be very, very close. But ultimately, and I'm sure you've discussed this multiple times on your show, it's going to come down to your key swing states. And that's either going to be your blue wall of Michigan, Minnesota, Pennsylvania, or it's going to be you're going to do the Pennsylvania, North Carolina, Georgia. Oddly enough, Arizona and Nevada have found themselves in play. What I think shows that there is some hope for Donald Trump in those states, and in 2020 definitely went for Biden, except for North Carolina, is that you're seeing Trump continuing to fight in those states. He's continuing to hold rallies. He's continuing to hold people, and it also helps who's on the ballot, down ballot as well. I mean, here's the reality of it. Donald Trump, and I think this is what Democrats are somewhat counting on. If Donald Trump gets elected, he goes in the White House, he's going to be impeached on day one of his inauguration if he doesn't have the House and the Senate also control of them. At the same time, he's got to make sure in 2016, one of his biggest problems is the Republicans might have had the House and the Senate, but they were definitely not a part of Trump's agenda. So he ended up fighting his own party, his own Congress, hence why he didn't get much done in that first administration. So we cannot ignore on Election Day the impact that the House and the Senate are going to have on Donald Trump, or else we're going to start with impeachment hearings from his very first day in office, being wrapped up in turmoil of those. So I think part of the Trump campaign strategy is to not only win at the very top, but to continue in those down ballot states. And I think that's why you're seeing him also fight for some of these Senate seats, knowing how important that they're going to be.
And just lastly, on the question of money, if this was only about money, Kamala Harris would have won this election. 3-1, she outstripped Donald Trump in terms of the amount of money she's managed to raise for her campaign. So how has Trump managed to do relatively well and narrow that gap with 1/3 of the amount of money that Kamala Harris has managed to raise?
That is such an excellent question to point out. And I have to give you some kudos because you're the first person that's actually put the financial numbers on it. I hate money in politics. I wish we could go back to the day where you could, stand on the street corner and you didn't need to have, a $5 million screen behind you and whole staff behind you lifting you up in order to win. In 2016, Donald Trump ran the most frugal campaign possible ever seen in modern day presidential history. Why was he able to win? Well, it wasn't because he bought flashy ads or push cards. It was because his message resonated. And I think this is why, to bring it full circle back to how we started, Donald Trump is a man, but he's representing a movement. The movement doesn't need dollars in order to push forward. That's not what consultants want you to hear. That's not what very expensive strategists and campaigns, those that work in the campaign and election world want you to hear. It's all about the message. And you can have zero, you can have a very low budget, but if your message is what the American people earnestly want and you're a genuine teller of that message, I believe you can get elected. And I think that's why you're seeing Donald Trump being able to handle the 3-1 spending and the 3-1 fundraising that he's seen against Kamala Harris.
Okay, we're going to have to leave it there. We're out of time. Thank you so much. Scotty, Nell, Hughes, thank you for speaking to Al Arabiya.
Thank you.
Well, for more reaction, I'm joined now by the former chief speechwriter to President Bill Clinton, David Kusnet. Thank you very much indeed for joining us. You're also a published author. I'd like to start by asking you about the speech given by Kamala Harris last night in D.C. It was called a closing arguments speech, and it had a sort of a legal theme to it with the U.S. public as the jury. Do you think it worked?
I think it did. She's as you know, and as she reminded the audience, she's a former prosecutor, and she knows how to give a closing argument. And the venue was very important. The venue was the Ellipse, which is really the public park of American democracy. And it's also where then President Donald Trump gave a fire-breathing speech on January 6th and sent a crowd of his supporters to attack the nation's capital and try to undo the result of an election. So the setting was as important for her as the arguments, but I think she made arguments that were fitting for the setting and that closed her case to the American people.
And as a former speechwriter, I'm curious to know what you made of her tone and her overall delivery.
Well, I think she had the challenge of having a tone and delivery that would be authoritative, that would not be so harsh as to offend the audience, but it also had a seriousness in keeping with this moment in history and in keeping with the moment in history, January 6th, 2021, which the setting for her speech was intended to recall. And I think she did that well.
How many people do you think watched it? I mean, do you think it was a very closely watched event right across the United States? Or do you think at this pretty late stage in the day, most people have made up their minds already, and the only people that would have watched it are people who've already decided they like what she says? What do you think about the viewership?
Well, the immediate audience was very impressive. I've seen estimates of as many as 75,000 people in the immediate audience, and that lends a gravity to the speech. If there's an audience, an in-person audience of 75,000. As you know, people no longer observe events only in real time. In addition to whoever might have been watching live coverage, there's coverage on the traditional media and the evening news. There's coverage on cable news. It's pushed out on what used to be called Twitter and other social media. So I think probably tens of millions of people were in some way exposed to what she was saying.
But do you think that someone who already has decided they're going to vote for Donald Trump would have bothered to listen to any of it, or would they just completely disregard it?
I don't think it's intended. I don't think it was intended for people who have already voted for Donald Trump or intend to vote for him. And I don't think it was intended for people who obviously have already voted for Vice President Harris or have a plan for voting between now and Election Day. I think it was intended for people who are either undecided on whom to vote for or undecided on whether to vote. It was intended really for the you might call it the softer segment of the electorate, people who are not certain votes for either candidate and may not even be certain to vote.
And you've obviously been following US politics for a long time. You were active during the Clinton administration. And with the polls tightening, here we are, 6 days away from Election Day. I just wonder, what have you seen in the past with regards to the impact that a sort of a last-ditch speech like last night's one was? What sort of a difference it makes to the overall polls?
Well, it's part of the totality of what people are seeing and hearing and experiencing and thinking during the final week of the election campaign. And unlike 1992 and the cycles immediately after 1992, we no longer really have an election day. We have an election season, but there's most of the great majority of the people who are eligible to vote have not yet voted, and they're going to be barraged with a lot of information over the next 6 days. And I think that Vice President Harris's speech yesterday was a very effective closing argument. And part of what it does is not only reach the audience that are reached by the speech itself or by some sort of coverage or pushing out of that speech, but it also frames the remainder of what they hear.
It's been about 100 days. I think it's exactly 100 days, isn't it, since Kamala Harris was nominated as the party's candidate in this election. I'm just curious to know why you think the polls have tightened to the extent they have done. Because back in August, I remember opinion polls quite consistently putting Kamala Harris about 4 percentage points ahead of Donald Trump. Do you think her campaign team got a bit complacent?
I think it's been a remarkable 100-day campaign. It's sort of as if she's been running maybe a campaign for the kind of calendar that there are in countries other than the United States, where the campaign, by our standards, is relatively compressed. And she was able to literally and figuratively hit the ground running and present herself as a presidential candidate, which is very different from being vice president in this country. Vice presidents in this country have a mixed record of becoming president. You just have to ask Walter Mondale, who I worked for, or Hubert Humphrey, or Dan Quayle, or Al Gore, and others who ran for president and didn't make it because they're typecast as being a number 2 and not a number 1. So I think she's run a great campaign. I think you have maybe what statisticians call regression to the mean, which is this is a very closely divided country. And you look at 2016, 2020, the polls between Donald Trump and Joe Biden before Joe Biden withdrew, and it's very close. And it's sort of, and I think it's, at least if you can believe the polling, it's going back to what have been the lines of division in this country over the last 8 years or so.
The last 8 years or so, but not anything like the era when, for example, Bill Clinton, who used to write speeches when he was around. I mean, something dramatic has happened in American society, hasn't it, in these last
when you look back at the 1992 election, it was a very different America with a very different demography and very different what now are overlapping economic and cultural and political divides. Bill Clinton carried West Virginia. Bill Clinton was the first Democrat since Lyndon Johnson to carry California. It was a very different America then. Bill Clinton, of course, he came from Arkansas, and Al Gore came from Tennessee, but we carried Arkansas and Tennessee. In 2000, Al Gore did not carry Arkansas, and he didn't even carry his home state of Tennessee. And for people who are listening who don't follow American politics in a granular way, Arkansas and Tennessee are what are called border states between the North and the South. And culturally, they're increasingly conservative, and they haven't voted Democratic since the Bill Clinton era, but they were part of Bill Clinton's base in 1992. So the country is polar. The country's always divided in some way. That's why you have elections. But the divides in this country are very different from what they were 32 years ago.
Yeah, and it's almost like two distinct camps, isn't it? With the margin being so razor thin, if the polls are to be believed. And just talking about the distinctiveness of the 2024 campaign versus previous campaigns, I remember back in 2008, Barack Obama was credited for having used social media very much to his advantage in that election. Has anything stood out for you with this election, the 2024 presidential election, in terms of a new phenomenon or something we haven't seen perhaps as much of in previous elections?
Well, I think in recent times, every election or every few elections, as you say, there's a difference in how the voters consume information and how the candidates try to reach the voters. The Bill Clinton campaign was really one of the first campaigns of the 24-hour news cycle, cable news, and sort of niche programming on broadcast television. There were the famous shows where he played the saxophone on entertainment shows. And as you say, Barack Obama was the first candidate to use social media, like what used to be called Twitter. And now I think a new element, podcasts have been around for a while, but this has been almost the podcast election, where you have both candidates micro-targeting the podcasts they appear to the demographics they're trying to mobilize. And you've had Vice President Harris speaking on podcasts that probably disproportionately reach young women. And you've had Donald Trump on podcasts that really are targeted to not just to young men, but to young men in a way that sort of excludes other people, whether older people or women and young women. And there's been this kind of cultural micro-targeting through media that micro-target.
Yeah, that's really interesting. The podcast seems to be standing out, doesn't it, as being a distinct feature of this race to the White House. Another feature of this race to the White House, and it's probably not new, and you might be able to tell me about past races to the White House, but quite a lot of gaffes being made on all sides, and comments, some of them meant in good humor, that are ending up costing votes on both sides. Let's talk about what was said on Sunday at Madison Square Garden, that comment about Puerto Rico being a floating island of garbage. I mean, Donald Trump, it appears, has been in disaster management mode for the last 24 hours on that. Do you think he's succeeded in perhaps putting that one to bed and laying that saga to rest?
I don't think so. I think it's difficult to say that what the so-called comedian said at the rally without Donald Trump objecting to it, and without a lot of the audience seeming to object to it. I think it's hard to say that calling Puerto Rico an island, a floating garbage dump, or whatever he called it, it's hard to see how that was meant in good humor. And I think that also reinforced a visual image that people remember of Donald Trump going to the scene of a disaster in Puerto Rico when he was president, and throwing paper towels at people, rather than seeming to take their condition seriously and take seriously his responsibility as president to help them overcome the catastrophe. And there's just such a record of Donald Trump and his supporters and his presence attacking different segments of the American people that what happened at Madison Square Garden resonated. And if I could just do a little bit of recall some history, this is the media change and the divisions change in America, but there's some events that tend to happen over and over again. And back in the 19th century, there was a presidential election where the Republican presidential candidate also appeared at a meeting in New York, and one of the speakers before the presidential candidate, attacked Romanism and rebellion, Romanism being the Roman Catholic Church. And the presidential candidate, James Blaine, did not object to that, and that contributed to a lot of Irish and German American Catholics voting Democratic in larger numbers than usual. And the first Democratic president since the Civil War, Grover Cleveland, being elected. So there's always been a history of campaigns sabotaging themselves by attacking segments of the electorate. It's the media that tend to change.
Yeah, indeed. Message. That was 1884, and as
That's
you say,
right. You are a scholar.
Not without precedent, as you say. I want to pick up on a different gaffe, though. So the Sunday gaffe, or that comment that people found offensive at Madison Square Garden, triggered a comment by Joe Biden yesterday, who said, the only garbage I could see out there floating was his supporters. Was that an ill-advised comment for Joe Biden to make? And do you think he's becoming a bit more...
I think the difference is that Joe Biden's denying that's what he meant. And no one connected with Trump has really denied that the slurs that their campaign has engaged in are what they mean. And I think the other difference is whether you choose to believe it or not, the Biden camp has the plausible explanation that he's someone who grew up with a speech impediment as a young man. And there's a history that if you have a speech impediment when you're younger, they tend to return when you're older. And they at least have an explanation. You can accept it or not for why he misspeaks. The Trump supporters really don't have an explanation for why Donald Trump is constantly attacking segments of society and why people connected with him are doing that.
Yeah, I was trying to analyze.
I think the difference, if nothing else, is a sense of shame and norms. That if something like that comes out of the Biden camp, they apologize and they try to offer an explanation. With Donald Trump, there's no apology and there's no explanation.
Yeah, I was going to ask you, do you think that Joe Biden has become more of a liability than an asset to the Harris campaign? Because she has got a younger former president who's out there flying the flag for her as well, in the form of Barack Obama. Do you think it's fair to say that Team Harris would rather that perhaps at this stage Joe Biden didn't get too involved in her campaign effort?
Well, once again, history, as the saying goes, history doesn't repeat itself, but it rhymes. When you look at other vice presidents who have run for president as vice president, the president tends to recede into the background. No one, if you go back to 1968, no one ever called Lyndon Johnson a shrinking violet, but he did not play much of a role in Hubert Humphrey's campaign in 1968. Closer to the recent past, and something I very much remember, Al Gore did not use Bill Clinton as much as some people thought he should have done, because I think understandably he didn't want to be overshadowed by Bill Clinton. And while he was part of, and I'm proud of being part of Bill Clinton's public record, he didn't want to be connected with all of Bill Clinton's personal behavior. So there is, whatever you think about Joe Biden, there is a history of, if you have a sitting president whose vice president is running for president, there is a history of the sitting president sort of staying in the background.
Okay, last question to you. We're perhaps a week away from knowing the outcome of this election. I don't know if you think we're going to have an answer or not by this time next week. We might not. But with 6 days of campaigning left to go, I just want to ask you, lastly of all, what you think the campaign is going to be focused on and should be focused on during these next and last 6 days.
Well, I think that as with Vice President Harris's speech yesterday, at least I won't pretend to presume to know what on earth Donald Trump will be talking about, but I think Vice President Harris's campaign needs to have two levels of message. I think one of them is sort of the meta message about the survival of American democracy against a rival who talks about being a dictator on day one. And the other message is, as she also talked about yesterday, is about bread and butter. It's about wages and prices. It's about helping people make their lives better. And I think she melded the two by saying that when she becomes president, her focus won't be on revenge and retribution. It will be on improving working people's lives. So I think you need those two messages and you need to meld the two.
All right, well, we're out of time. Really appreciate you taking the time to talk to us and sharing your encyclopedic historical knowledge of all things US election. David Kusnet, thank you very much indeed.
Well, thank you.
Well, the former president and Republican presidential nominee Donald Trump has distanced himself from the racist remarks made by allies at his New York rally on Sunday. Speaking at a rally of his own in Allentown, Pennsylvania, Trump thanked Latinos for their support.
And I'm so proud that we're getting support from Latinos like never before. We're setting every record. Hispanics, Latinos, Nobody loves our Latino community and our Puerto Rican community more than I do. Nobody. Incredible people, energetic, smart, great entrepreneurial people. We appreciate, and we have a lot of them here tonight. Thank you very much. Latinos, Hispanics, Puerto Rico.
So, has that event on Sunday damaged Donald Trump? Well, to answer that, I'm joined now by the former communications director for the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Kristian Ramos. Thank you very much indeed for speaking to us. First of all, is the furor surrounding Sunday's event, and in particular the comedian labeling Puerto Rico as an island of garbage, is that dying down, or does the debate continue?
No, I think it absolutely is relevant, and if anything, is only picking up importance in places like Pennsylvania and Allentown, when you have a lot of Puerto Ricans there that are going to be casting their vote on November 5th. I think we have an incredible opportunity here to capitalize on exactly how toxic MAGA is to the Latino community, to Black people, to this country. And so, no, I don't think it's dying down. I think this is very relevant and will be relevant all the way through Election Day.
Trump obviously trying to move on from those comments and that controversy about the remarks in Madison Square Garden. It sounds to me like you think he has not succeeded in doing that at all.
Has he apologized? Has he said anything
Not
at all?
personally, no.
No, and his campaign hasn't apologized. Nobody's apologized. And what I think is fascinating is you've seen people who wanted to stay on the sidelines, like Bad Bunny, enter into this conversation in a real way. His endorsement is a Thanos-level event for Democrats, for those folks in Pennsylvania and North Carolina. There's a lot of Puerto Ricans there. Those states are hotly contested right now, and it could really make the difference. And the reality is, look, Donald Trump, at the end of the day, he did not give money to Puerto Rico when the hurricane came and devastated it. When he went, he was throwing towels at Puerto Ricans who are looking for food and for help. He has a dismal record with Puerto Ricans. And so in a state like Pennsylvania, again, where Puerto Ricans make up a huge number of those voters, this is really bad for him heading into the general election.
Well, he says, and he said this yesterday, he's done more for Puerto Rico than any president, I think, that's ever been president. What's he getting at?
I have no idea. That's not true. So if you could tell me anything that he's done that would help Puerto Rico in the last, in his presidency. Again, yeah, I think he's referring to that visit that he made after the storm during his presidency.
There in Allentown in Pennsylvania yesterday, we had Donald Trump saying he loves Latinos. Do you believe him when he says he loves Latinos?
Well, let's review here. He started his presidential campaign in 2016 by calling Mexicans rapists and murderers. And he's ending his current presidential campaign by saying that Puerto Rico is an island of garbage. He lost more jobs for Latinos than any president in the history of the country, right? He's the only president to leave office with less jobs created than when he came in. And he continues to demonize our community, saying that immigrants are are poisoning the blood of our country, echoing Hitler. He's compared immigrants to rats. No, I don't think Donald Trump loves Latinos. No.
And just looking at, you mentioned Pennsylvania being a state with a really important Latino and Puerto Rican community, 450,000 people of Puerto Rican heritage just in Pennsylvania, a swing state. I mean, are they all on the same page, do you think, or mostly on the same page? And therefore, how expensive a mistake do you think it was to have Tony Hinchcliffe on the stage on Sunday?
So I am fortunate to have a lot of Puerto Rican friends, right? There is one thing I can say with absolute confidence about Puerto Ricans. They love their island. They have incredible pride in where they come from. And they are very, very passionate about their politics. And so what I hear from folks in Pennsylvania, what I hear from folks, all over the country, they're mad. And those folks who are on the sidelines, who felt like, they didn't know how they were going to vote this election, they know now. They are ready to go out and elect Kamala Harris for president. So, this is a disaster for Donald Trump, any way you slice it.
And when it comes to Latino representation in US politics, do you think one party has done a better job than the other in terms of promoting people to prominent figures within the party who come from a Latino heritage and therefore are better at building bridges with those communities?
Absolutely. The Democratic Party has the stronger record in terms of, you name it, cabinet officials, government officials, elected officials. I don't even think there's a comparison here. And I think it's remarkable to me how bad Republicans are at this. And that's not to say that there aren't conservatives that are Latino. There are, of course. I think 30% of Latinos in this country are conservatives, but the majority are Democrats because the party continues to deliver for them and is, been good for their bottom line over the last modern political history.
Just reading some articles about Latino voters, their voter intentions, and how they feel going into this election. And obviously, you're much better placed than I am reading articles to say whether this is true or not. But a lot of people quoted as saying they feel a sense of political homelessness. Do you think political homelessness is not a term I knew about before, but do you think that's a good term to describe a large section of the Latino community in the United States?
So what I think is true is younger Latinos in general, and particularly younger Latino men, do not have party preference. I think when they are looking at the country and the political parties, they have a lot of questions, and they're trying to figure out exactly how they fit into this conversation. And so I think that's fair for a part of the Latino community, absolutely. And I think generally speaking, this election cycle, probably more than in past, Latinos are open to hearing from both parties. But I think the real issue here is the other parties is a dumpster fire. MAGA is not a serious political movement. It is really sad and scary what they stand for.
Is there anything that stands out when it comes to priorities at the forefront of voters' minds when they're casting their ballots? Is there anything that stands out when you look at opinion polls as being higher up the list of concerns amongst the Latino demographic in the United States?
Look, I think the economy is always going to be critically important to this community, as it is to all voters. I think Kamala has an incredible record to run on. I think Kamala has an incredible story to tell of job creation, small business creation, and has done incredible work for the Latino community. What I find fascinating is this conversation that we're having about immigration, and in particular, mass deportation. Work that we've done with the Valiente Action Fund around mass deportation, research that we did found that most people have no idea what it is. And so you have some polls that sort of show support for it, but once you unpack that, and once you really go into the human cost of what that would look like, people do not like it. People do not want it. And so I do think this is another sort of area where Donald Trump has really run on an issue that's very unpopular with most people once they understand what it is. He refuses to talk about it. Right? He refuses to say this is exactly what mass deportation does and is. So, yeah, it's wild.
And yet, I mean, and this is again, I know the polls are obviously open to interpretation. There are many polls that say different things, but one poll I've been looking at shows Kamala Harris is about 13 points ahead of Donald Trump amongst Latino voters. But that's not very much, is it? When you consider that Joe Biden in 2020 had about a 26-point lead. So I'm just wondering why you think the gap has narrowed so significantly.
Well, I think it really depends on the poll you're looking at. I think if you're looking at high quality polls with oversamples of Latinos that are just Latino voters, Kamala Harris breaks 60, which is more or less where Joe Biden was in 2020. So, you know, I don't want to get on the roller coaster with you here. What I see in early vote numbers is that Latinos are supporting Kamala at roughly the same amount that they did at this time in 2020. And, you know, we have a lot of time left on the clock here. Well, 7 days, but there's time to continue to grow and build on those numbers. So I feel good about where we are right now.
Do you think this is going to be very much, I mean, these next 6 days obviously are going to be crucial. And it was always going to be down to 7 swing states. It was always going to be down to winning over certain demographics. Do you think this issue of offense caused to Latino people in the United States is going to be looked back upon as being the deciding factor in what was already going to be a razor-thin margin election?
So I think everybody is very focused on the Electoral College, rightly so. I think for the blue wall states, right, Michigan, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Latinos and Puerto Ricans in particular in Pennsylvania and Allentown are going to be critically important to winning. In Nevada and Arizona, Latinos are also going to be in the Sun Belt states, also critically important. So Nevada, Arizona, Georgia, also very important. And then you throw in North Carolina, also incredibly important. There are a lot of paths to victories for Kamala here, less so for Donald Trump. And I think that makes me cautiously optimistic about where we're going to be on Election Day. But right now, yeah, it's going to be a very close race. And I think it was always going to come down to, as you said, these battleground states, but more importantly, Black and Latino voters are going to be critically important to Kamala in those states, right? In Georgia, North Carolina, Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Michigan. That's that combination of those two that are going to help put us over the top.
Yeah, and from this part of the world, obviously, we're very interested in the voting intentions of Arab Americans, Muslim Americans, in particular with regards to the Biden administration's track record on foreign policy, and that's something very much that we've discussed. But I'm just wondering whether, this is my last question to you, whether you think that the sudden winning over of more Latino voters from the Trump campaign is going to somehow compensate for the loss of votes that perhaps Kamala Harris could have counted on were it not for the Biden administration's record on foreign policy in the Middle East?
Well, so I don't see that as of yet, as it relates to foreign policy. What I see is a lot of frustration around the economy. I see a lot of frustration around cost of living and the housing and things like that. And you know, we haven't lost these voters. That remains to be seen. What's going to happen there? I feel fairly confident we're gonna do okay. But yeah, I don't see that as it relates to foreign policy with the Latino community here domestically.
Okay, we're going to leave it there. Thank you so much for taking the time to speak to us, former communications director for the Congressional Hispanic Caucus, Kristian Ramos. Thank you very much indeed. Well, as the election draws ever closer, Kamala Harris's lead over Donald Trump has narrowed significantly, according to the latest Ipsos poll. Harris now leads by a slim margin, 44% to Trump's 43%, leaving her with only a 1-point advantage nationwide. Well, that poll also shows that Harris's lead has gradually decreased since late September. Well, a separate Rasmussen poll points to a possible challenge for the vice president regarding public perception. The poll indicates that 47% of likely US voters view her favorably. 33% express a very favorable opinion. However, 51% have an unfavorable view, with 44% holding a very unfavorable impression of her. Well, national polling averages, including 538's tracker, show the Democratic presidential nominee with a 1.4-point lead over the former president, underscoring just how close the race has become in its final days. Let's get more now with the Trump biographer and author of The Trumps, 3 Generations of Builders and a President. Gwenda Blair, thank you so much indeed for taking the time to speak to us. Back in 2016, when you wrote your book, you said in the preface, there is nothing authentic or spontaneous about what Donald Trump says. Everything is considered strategic. And then you go on to describe him as being the most artificial of creatures in every possible respect. Here we are, 8 years since you wrote that. Has he changed?
Not a bit. Not a bit.
So you fully stand by that. Why do you think he's so artificial? What is it about? What's your argument, and why do you think he remains someone who is, in your view, so artificial?
He has made really the country, arguably the world, into a kind of reality world, reality nation, reality world, coming off of his success beginning in 2004 with that television show, The Apprentice, an early reality TV hit, in which nothing is really quite real. You don't exactly know. You think you know it's a TV show, but as soon as you start watching, you forget. And watching him, you think this is an authentic candidate making, an argument. And then you forget that, but he's actually performing. He's performing as a candidate. He's performing as someone who can do all these things. And there's no kind of there. There's a performance. There's early on in his career, someone coined the phrase exaggerated hyperbole to describe how he conducts himself, what he says to the world. And that really, I was thinking about that this morning. It's really a kind of grandiose way of saying lying. Exaggerated hyperbole means not the truth. And he has carried that forward.
And when you say he's not spontaneous, I mean, we sometimes hear Donald Trump make speeches and they do sometimes not respect a particular time frame. They seem to go on quite a long time. I'm just wondering whether you think that lack of spontaneity endures, or whether you think he's got perhaps a bit more spontaneous with the passage of time.
I think there's a kind of pretense of spontaneity in a way. It's all about sort of control and controlling the experience of someone watching him, of saying that he's the one who's deciding whether what he says is going to happen, is going to not happen. He is, as we have seen over the years, constantly saying something, then stepping away from it and saying, oh, you didn't get that was a joke. You didn't get that I was being sarcastic. So there's no kind of enduring through line. It's all aimed at that. So that is the sense in which I said he's not spontaneous. It's all aimed at the notion that only he can decide whether what he said he really meant. And at any given moment, he could say, oh, I didn't really mean it, or I meant it even more so, and go back and forth. He's the one who gets to decide. And it's that kind of control over how people experience what he's saying. In that sense, it's not spontaneous.
Gwenda, let's talk a bit about Donald Trump supporters and the nearly 50% of Americans who are most likely going to vote for him next Tuesday. Do you think the profile of a typical Donald Trump supporter has changed over the years, certainly since he first came onto the political scene? Or do you think the socio-economic profile of the average Trump supporter has largely remained the same? What's your thinking on this?
This is the 64, we used to say million, billion, trillion, quadrillion dollar question. And it seems in one sense, no, it hasn't changed, because these are people who want permission to be really angry and to really hate somebody else and to hold somebody else or some other they responsible for however things don't seem to be working out. So in that sense, that's an ongoing definition or identity. Who exactly fills that identity has shifted somewhat. After the Supreme Court decision that did away with the right to abortion, the people the Republican women who had been staunch Trump supporters have shifted over somewhat. There's been more of a gender divide. Women who used to vote for Trump, some number, we don't know how many, we won't know until after the election, have shifted over to wanting to vote for Kamala Harris, who promises to protect the right to abortion. And the Trump's message seems to have more appeal to people of color who have conservative views and are hearing that permission to be angry being given to them if they vote for him. So there's been somewhat of a shift within the people who fill out that identity, but I think the overall identity of people who want permission, who are attracted to the idea of permission to hate, to be angry, to think that someone else is responsible for why their lives aren't working, that remains the same.
And having studied Donald Trump and his family background so closely as you did when you wrote your book, do you find yourself able to second guess sort of what he's going to do, what he's going to say, how he's going to react in any given situation? Is that a sort of a knack you think you've been able to develop as someone who studied him so closely?
I'm not sure if I would call it a knack. I think an awful lot of people have a sense of what he's going to do. And what he's going to do is to be disruptive. What he's going to do is to do whatever he can to make the situation full of conflict and full of dissension, because that's his comfort zone. That's the place he likes to be. That's a place where people are confused, upset, disturbed, angry, and where someone who says, I can fix it, hand over the reins to me, I'll be in charge, where that kind of appeal can be very strong. We've seen that in other autocratic situations, and I think that's the situation that's unfolding in the United States. And so I don't know that I have a knack for exactly what he's going to say, but it is going to be targeted and aimed at upending everything, making people upset, concerned, fearful, at telling them that their lives are crappy, the country is a mess, enemies within, enemies without, and only one person can fix it. It's not a message of conciliation, of community, of support. No, that's not what it is. It's a message of conflict.
And having studied not just Donald Trump, but previous generations of Trumps, I mean, to what extent do you think Donald Trump is his own persona, his own self-made persona, and to what extent do you think he's the product of those previous generations?
He's taken it to the Trump family culture to the next level. That is absolutely true. But it has been a transactional family culture in which anything goes if it's self-interest, and in which everything is put through an analysis of whether will help out whichever generation of Trump it is. The grandfather who had saloons in the west of the United States, kind of at the end of the 19th century, in which the market was single young men out there in the gold rush, and he provided liquor, food, proximity to women. That's what was going to make a fortune, or a small fortune, not a gigantic one, but enough of a nest egg. And he also left Germany just young enough to escape mandatory military service, tried to go back just old enough to be ineligible for service. So that was another kind of transactional move. And Donald's father, Fred, made a much larger fortune out of federal government supports for housing in the 30s, 40s, 50s in the New York City area mostly. And he saw the kind of wiggle room place for himself to be able to extract windfall profits out of that whole arrangement of federal support for housing. And he did very well by that. And Donald saw kind of the next generation was in one in which he saw, that is Donald, that the opportunity was going to be for that same transactional self-interest moves was going to be through branding, through making himself as big as possible so that he could get away with as much as possible.
And just lastly, I mean, obviously we can turn our attention now to future generations of Trumps. There's perhaps another book in here for you, because Donald Trump is now himself a grandfather. He's 78 years old. In your view, what will a second Trump presidency look like? Or what would it look like, I should say, if he wins?
A second Trump presidency? What would that look like? I think it would be off the rails. That the first Trump presidency, he did have people in his administration who seemed to have kind of kept the lid on to some degree, who had some regard for precedent, who had some regard for the law, who had some regard for appearances. And he, in the 8 years since that he was elected the first time, there has been a concerted effort by people who support him to erect a much more armored, I'm not sure if I want to say bulletproof, but let's just say well-armored effort to plow ahead and not to be constrained by precedent, not to be constrained by history, not to be constrained by popular expectations, not to be constrained by anything in promoting this sort of whole transactional government in which the goal is to be to the profit and well-being of Donald Trump.
Okay, well, we're going to have to leave it there. I'm being told we're out of time, but I'd like to say a very big thank you to you, Gwenda, Blair, for taking the time to speak to us here on Al Arabiya News.
Oh, my great pleasure. Nice to be with you.
Well, that is all we have time for today's edition of Global News Today. Thank you for watching. Be sure to join us again tomorrow for more exclusive interviews. Until then, goodbye.